Well, you're watching Breakthrough News and you are on the freedom side. You see, it ends with which side are you on? You're on the freedom side. See what I did there? Sorry, I'm just taking a page from your book, Rania, where you explain the thing after you say it.
Is that what I do? Is that what I do?
Well, you know what? Including with all your jokes.
It's a part of my charm, Eugene. It's a part of my. I just want to make sure everybody gets it.
I respect that.
Left out of the fun.
You're about accessibility. It's one of the things that we all love about you. Well, welcome everyone to the Freedom Side here on Breakthrough News. Once again, I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Kalik. As you might be able to tell, it's always a pleasure to be back alongside Rania.
It's always a pleasure to be back on alongside you, Eugene. I'm excited for the show today. There's so much we're going to be talking about. But Eugene, first,
yes,
before we get started, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that you can support Breakthrough News and all of our excellent programming here, if I do say so myself, by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive content. And also for those who are watching live, you can always donate in the chat, or on most of our videos, I believe you can donate on YouTube for a one-time donation. But again, you can access exclusive content by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And I encourage those who are watching to not only subscribe to Breakthrough News if you haven't already on YouTube, but also to make sure that you like the show. It helps us in the algorithm.
And well, Rania, I just want to note as well, we have a new mug that is available for patrons. There's actually coffee in here, so I have to be very careful about how I turn this.
That is a nice
as you can see, Breakthrough News, one side. There it is. That's the vibe. BT on the other side.
Cool.
You can only get this exclusively if you become a patron. So you have to go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News to get this brand new, very exciting mug, in addition to all the great things that you also can get. We've got other good swag that's coming out for you. Of course, we've got exclusive content, but you can definitely get that mug. We are new and improved in the gift department here at Breakthrough News. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and you too could be watching the Freedom Side drinking out of a mug that looks just like the mug I will be drinking out of this evening.
Well, I'm going to have to upgrade my mug because I have like the old logo on my mug. So I guess I have to become a patron.
Well, you should definitely become a patron. But that's also a good mug. I'm not taking anything away from it. I've got my own, of course. I drink out of it on a regular basis. So if you've been a patron for a long time, maybe, well, I don't know really what to tell you to do. Maybe up your patronage, and then we'll get you a new mug, and you can start to collect them over time as you increase your contribution to Breakthrough News. But nonetheless, we appreciate your contribution whenever it was made. All of our recurring donors, one-time donors, friends, watchers, everyone who spreads the word about the show, which is certainly something that you should think about doing right now. As Rania mentioned, we've got a great show, as we always do, talking about so many of the things going on around the world and the United States as well, of course. The attack the attack on Black America, really, although in the guise of academia, the heat wave that's baking the planet, and more importantly, what we should do about it, ongoing protests happening in Israel, and also an eyewitness report from China. A good friend of the show who was recently there on a trip and is going to give us some sense of what he saw and from his perspective, what's really going on. So, I don't know, put an air horn out there, yell, text, call, do whatever you feel you need to do to let folks know that we are here and that we are live so that they are able to follow us. We want whoever is following you to be able to follow us. And relatively quickly here, we'll be going to our first story, but obviously, Rania, there's a lot of news out there, but maybe one of the most notable things that's happening is there's been a coup, or at least there's an ongoing coup in the Sahelian nation of Niger. And I would also note, for anyone who's interested in this broader issue of what's happening in the Sahel region, back in March, I was able to join Rania on her show, Dispatches, and we had a wide-ranging, about hour-long conversation that I think would be very important for those who are looking to find out what's happening there in Niger. I would say we don't fully know. It appears that The Republican Guard of Niger, alongside some elements of the military, have taken the president hostage and are holding him in the presidential compound. They appear to have at least some level of control over the airport, the borders. They've closed down the borders to the country. They've closed off the airspace. There's a ban on certain elements, political parties. I believe the parliament suspended. So it does seem that the coup forces have some level of control, but I believe it's the prime minister, I think, of Niger, one of the top officials like that, seems to be in some sort of undisclosed location, and somebody who had control of the president's Twitter account was saying they were going to fight back. But of course, Niger is, really one of the main Western allies in Africa, in the Sahel. There's 2 U.S. drone bases there, including one of the largest drone bases I think that the U.S. has anywhere in the world. There are French troops there. There are Italian troops there. So it's a major node in the Western, quote unquote security, I think some might say neo-colonial apparatus there on the African continent. So given what's happened in Mali and Burkina Faso, where that apparatus has fallen to the masses of people, this is Niger, it's Mali, Burkina Faso is kind of right underneath it. Sorry, it's the opposite way. And then Niger is right next to it. So all 3 countries very close to each other. And Guinea, which is also in a similar situation, connected there to Mali. So, could be very significant in a lot of different ways, Rania, in terms of what the future is going to be there in the African continent, at least that region of it.
It's interesting, Eugene. I am not sitting here saying yay for a coup. I don't know the details of what's taking place, but I do, after what you say, just notice real quick that I'd like to note to you as well as our viewers that according to the New York Times, this coup shakes a pillar of democracy in West Africa. So I don't know what you just described to me. Coups are terrible, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't sound very, very democracy-like from what you just described. And also the State Department the words they used were gravely concerned. So I just want to throw those 2 out there. I love they're always gravely concerned, deeply concerned. It's like they just copy and paste.
Blinken is in New Zealand. I think he said he's watching it very closely. So we shall see. I mean, there's the president of Nigeria, Mr. Tinubu, he's the head of also ECOWAS now. He's sent Patrice Talon, who is the president of Benin, to Niger, which, speaking to your point about pillars of democracy, is interesting because Benin is, of course, widely known for people being sent into exile and into prison, political parties being banned, and so on and so forth in the context of the elections. But nonetheless, Mr. Talon is headed there. I think he's already there, allegedly supposed to be mediating the thing, but it seems like maybe we've gotten out of that. The Nigerian coup government, I guess you'd call it now, are claiming that France has been violating their airspace. So it could become serious. I mean, it reminds me maybe the most of what happened in Cote d'Ivoire in 2010 when there was a coup that overthrew Laurent Gbagbo, and who, by the way, was then taken to the ICC and won his case. But France intervened to back the current, head of Cote d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara, to come to power. And they had like this long military march from the sort of central northern part of Cote d'Ivoire. They had all these French helicopters and special forces murdering people, of course, all along the way. Then they installed him there as the president. But he's considered to be a great Democrat by the West. So it makes you wonder if we might see something similar, if these U.S., French, Italian troops will try to perhaps intervene on behalf of the former president there, Mr. Bazoum, to put him back in power.
Is it in Niger where French troops are like right across the street from a uranium mine? Like there's like a French military base?
Basically, yeah. A good percentage of the uranium in France is coming from Niger and in multiple places. There's a statistic that I can't remember. I think it's like 1 in 3 light bulbs or something in France are powered by uranium from Niger or something of that nature. So, yeah, the Samir Amin, the late Marxist academic, he famously said that France would never allow Niger to fall because it has such a critical role in its sort of energy matrix, because nuclear energy, is the main energy there in France.
So here, by the way, I just want to clarify the statistic that you just noted. It comes from Oxfam. So in France, 1 of every 3 light bulbs is lit thanks to Nigerian uranium, whereas in Niger, nearly 90% of the population has no access to electricity. That's pretty jarring. Wow. However, France would never do the things that you just said. I don't know if that's accurate because from what I understand, France is a pillar. If Niger is a pillar of democracy, or was, France is a pillar of civilization and the civilized world. And I recommend. Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
No,
You
well, I
go.
think we actually have our first guest here, so why don't we just
Oh,
segue to that? But we'll, of course, keep following what's happening in Niger, and we'll do the best we can to continue to let folks know. So make sure you're following us on social media at BT Newsroom on all your platforms. But now we want to turn to Israel, and we are very happy to be joined here to discuss the situation on the ground there by David Sheen, who is an independent, on-the-ground investigative journalist. David, as always, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you both for having me. Good to be back.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and it's great to have you back. Last time we talked, there were huge protests in Israel over the judicial overhaul that was proposed at that time. Now we're sort of, in the post era, but there are large protests continuing to go on. Give us a sense of what the situation is there on the ground.
Well, admittedly, these are certainly the largest protests that we've seen from Jewish Israelis in at least a decade, perhaps more. What we're seeing is, as you've seen in the videos, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, in some cases, going out in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and all around the country protesting the changes that the government is making. You mentioned that one law has passed, but of course it's just one of dozens of laws that you and I would consider undemocratic. And because it was the first piece of this package of legislation, so of course a lot of tension, climax when it finally passed, and it did finally pass. So sure, that has broken some people's spirits, but I think that in the days and weeks to come, you're also going to see continued protests. People aren't going to let up about this because the issues that are being debated and passed in the Knesset and Israel's parliament are very, very serious. And secular nationalist Israelis who didn't protest for years and for decades while Israel was, occupying Palestinian people, and while the Supreme Court, for the most part, permitted that occupation. But now that there's a chance that that Supreme Court will be defanged and neutered, and that it won't have the ability to, even in extreme cases, put a pretty face on Israel's ethnocracy, and at least have the appearance of abiding by some kind of international order. So if the Supreme Court is neutered, then even that is gone. And of course, this means for secular Israelis that the rights that they hold dear, which have only ever been defended by the courts, rights of gay people, some rights of women in this country were only ever won in the courts, and have become precedent as such, but they were never anchored in law because we have a very conservative population and a conservative legislature. So these are very real reasons for people to go out into the streets, regardless of what we may, snicker, saying, well, yeah, it took you long enough to realize that Israel is a dictatorship only when that dictatorship is being directed towards yourselves as, until now, privileged citizens. But, wake up, smell the coffee. But still, at the same time, for them, it's a very, very serious issue.
Mm.
So, David, I'm curious. There's an aspect of this that I found somewhat interesting. I don't know how serious it actually is, but there was a number of reservists that were saying before this law was passed in the Israeli army that they would refuse to serve if this happened. Now that it's happened, I mean, is there actually a risk? Like the U.S. Department, the U.S. head of the Department of Defense, Lloyd Austin, actually spoke to his counterpart in Israel and made a point of this could be bad for Israel's security but is that actually true that could happen this could lead to some sort of breakdown of the Israeli army carrying out its occupation or is that just an exaggerated? I mean, CNN is very afraid of this, so that's why I'm asking, because I saw a few CNN segments on that.
Well, I mean, on one hand, the government is using that rhetoric. It's putting that message out there in a way to say, these people are using an illegitimate tactic, and they should, not be, and they should be delegitimized for even raising this issue. This is a much greater danger, so quell your protests. So certainly that's being used internally, and so I'm not surprised it's also spiraling outward. But from my sense, obviously I haven't polled people, but anecdotally I can tell you that I have seen, yes, in Hebrew, people who aren't previously on the left and had never failed to show up for reserve duty and been an integral part of the Army's, reservist system, are now saying, forget about it. Count me out. I've given in my, whether it's, whether they're serving in this unit or that, they're saying, I won't be showing up for reserve duty anymore. I've already given my notice. Not going to happen. Or people who, let's say, were volunteers with the police have said something similar. I'm not going to volunteer with the police anymore. So I think the numbers we've seen are at least, 1,000 people who now, of course, I can't say to, I don't know enough about the Israeli military's inner workings to say is that, but it's seemingly on the face of it, sure, it could be the beginning of, a hole in the dam that breaks open, and soon, the deluge will come. Certainly, it's unprecedented for people. There hasn't been a point in Israeli society where that's happened up until now. Sure, when we go back 40 years to the time of the first Israeli invasion of Lebanon, after some months, there was a protest movement where they brought, hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets that demanded an end to the war. But nothing like what you're talking about, a situation where people say, I'm not going to serve anymore because of the nature of the government is undemocratic. That's never happened.
I mean, sometimes it feels like you don't know how to parse what might be grandiose or too much, but certainly a lot of the commentary in the media here in the U.S., New York Times, Washington Post, is almost questioning whether or not, Israeli society, and I think this speaks to the point Rania was raising, is coming apart, like whether or not the center can hold, so to speak, because of the nature of these cleavages. I mean, I don't even know what that looks like, but does that seem possible or logical? Is it over the top? I mean, it seems very sort of apocalyptic the way it's often presented, but countries don't collapse that often, so it seems like, who knows?
Sure. Right. It is hard to say, but I'll say that I'll give you like a little breakdown of some events that have occurred in recent weeks. So obviously you've seen footage of Israelis occupying the Ayalon Highway, the largest highway in the country that runs through the center of Tel Aviv, and building bonfires and using other methods to stop traffic in each direction, and thereby saying, okay, we're throwing our bodies on the infrastructure of the country to bring it to a halt. Okay, so as a result of this, obviously this causes inconvenience to some, but if you ideologically oppose this, then you're especially angered to be inconvenienced by it. So what you have in recent weeks is some right-wingers who, let's say, live in different parts of the periphery of the country, will go to other settlements, other towns, villages in the same area, villages that they perceive whose inhabitants are somewhat more liberal than themselves, maybe less religious than themselves, maybe more likely to oppose the government's new legislation, and so they will actually blockade the entrance to this settlement. Say, no, you can't, because of what's happening in Tel Aviv, because we can't go there, so we're going to blockade you here. You can't go in and out of your settlement. So obviously that's a sign of Israeli society breaking down on one axis. And that's been happening several times in different places around the country. When the right wing does a protest, you have young youths marching through Tel Aviv, looking, grabbing rainbow flags, ripping them down, looking for people to fight. There's no question that it's a very serious threat that inter-community, inter-Jewish civil war is brewing, and that we're just at the very beginning of what could be a very long civil war, in fact.
David, I saw this statistic. I can't remember what exactly it was, but it was like a pretty high percentage of Israelis were polled saying that, like, if this law passed, they would consider leaving the country. And then somebody had joked, like, oh, like, where are they going to go back to, like, Brooklyn? Like, just like thinking of which I thought was a little bit funny, but in all seriousness here, though that's not that unserious, you're talking about a fracture within Israeli Jewish society, where you do have a takeover of the country by the far right, which is a new development domestically. It's been taking place. It's been evolving towards that direction for the last 2 decades. And it's something that you've been covering a lot. You've covered it in the context of these Israeli politicians being extremely genocidal in their rhetoric towards, for example, African refugees. And obviously we know that the way these Israeli politicians specifically talk about Palestinians, advocating for, insane levels of violence. Not that all Israeli politicians don't necessarily do this, but, you have the more far right politicians making very genocidal, openly racist and hateful, insightful statements. So is that I guess, evolution towards that sort of like religious fascistic element within the government taking over various aspects of the country. With regard to Palestinians, how do you connect that with what's taking place domestically within Israeli Jewish society? I mean, doesn't one feed the other?
Oh, most definitely. Okay, let's look at what. Okay, so we had the government this week pass that first piece of the legislation to curb the court's powers. And what happened hours later? What was the first piece of legislation that they put on, that they passed in the Knesset? Now that they have less holding them back and they can do more what they want, so they passed a law increasing the size of Israel's sundown towns. As you may or may not know, Israel has, of course, for a long time, for decades, unofficially, it's prevented non-Jews from moving into towns if Jews just don't want non-Jews in them. Of course, at a certain point, Palestinians who are themselves constrained and constricted because the government doesn't permit their towns to grow. So at a certain point, they got nowhere to live. So they will attempt, some of them will say, okay, well, why can't I move to that Jewish town if Israel is ostensibly a democracy? They'll move there and then be told, oh, no, you can't live here. Why? You just don't quite fit in. We don't want non-Jews here. The first time that this was, a Palestinian family said, well, I'm not just going to take that lying down. I'm going to take that to the courts. There was one example where the court said, okay, that's blatantly racist. There we will put a stop to that and say, no, Israel can't be that blatantly racist. So what the government did was just make a new law saying, okay, from now on, we're creating a method, a legal loophole by which you are permitted to be this racist and forbid entrance to non-Jews. Okay, that law passed in 2011. So what happened yesterday? The first new law they passed is to expand that law from 2011. If before, only villages with 400 families were permitted to refuse admittance to whoever they wanted. So now this is any village with 700 or more families. In a couple of years, that could be expanded to 1,000 or more families. Now, there's nothing special about a village of 1,000 families that would want its members or its inhabitants to protect their some kind of unique culture. It's just blatant racism. The irony is that for years, even though on one hand you'd say, the purpose of this legislation, in fact, the settlement project, is to increase the amount of Jews in these areas where the government wants more Jews to live because there's a local Arab majority, whether it's the West Bank or whether it's the Galilee or whether it's the Nakab in the south. So on one hand, the government wants Jews to move there. But on the other hand, some settlements, if you can imagine this, were actually slowing down their acceptance rate and not accepting new members because they were about to reach the 400 family limit, and they wanted to still be racist. And more than that, they wanted the right to be discriminatory, not only to non-Jews, of course, but also to Jews that they didn't want. For example, Jews of color, if it's Jews from the Arab countries or Jews from African countries, or divorced Jews, if it's single moms or divorced dads or whatnot, or if it's gay or lesbian Jewish families. So they want the ability to still be discriminate against who's allowed to live in their gated community. And as such, so for a while they resisted. But now that the government has solved this this issue, you could say, by expanding. So now, hundreds more villages all around the country can be, towns that they called sundown towns in the U.S., where you forbid people from living there that you consider undesirable. So Israel's become that much more racist, and that's before we even get to the West Bank, although that law is also applies to the West Bank settlements. That is about territory that Israel conquered in 1948. It is considered by international law to be Israeli territory. So that is coming home to roost. That's not even necessarily territories. That's an all full spectrum racism in Israel. That's the first thing that the government does as soon as it peels off some of its constraints. So in the days to come, we're going to see more and more chipping away, more ridiculously racist laws. They're too numerous to mention, but on every front, I can't help but at least somewhat sympathize with people who are seeing the privileges they had stripped away in favor, of course, of a rising elite that's going to have even more privileges, and worst of which, the privilege to ethnically cleanse the country of the non-Jews.
Well, David Sheen, investigative journalist there on the ground in Israel. As always, it's an honor to have you here to help us sort through all of these thorny issues on the freedom side.
Thanks so much for having me. Be well.
Well, it's, in a way, a good segue here, since we're already talking about racism. We want to turn our attention to curricula issues here in the United States, certainly Florida being the most notable, but all around the country, we are seeing major attacks on, Black history, Black literature, I would really say on Black America, on, our history and our culture, happening in many, many different ways. And we are really honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Dr. Deborah E. McDowell, who is the Alice Griffin Professor of English at the University of Virginia in my hometown of Charlottesville. Dr. McDowell, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. And, I feel we're living in a bizarro world here. I mean, we've got Florida telling people to teach about the pros and cons of slavery. You've got Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir being banned by high school or by school boards in different places. Color Purple being banned in different places. I mean, as a professor, as a teacher by trade, is it scary? Is it concerning? I mean, give us a sense of how it feels to be someone who's actually teaching in a climate that seems to be becoming increasingly difficult to tell the truth about race in America.
Well, that's a big question, and one it would take us weeks to try to answer. In the interest of full transparency, let me say that I am not much in the classroom these days, but I have clearly been following these developments. I am on the cusp of retirement, but I have followed these debates, which of course are not new. So when you ask, how does it feel? I would answer, well, I can think of very few times in the history of my education and in the history of my career when teaching about Black folks hasn't been controversial. So what's happening in Florida right now is just a continuation of an unbroken practice in the history of education in this country. It just seems to be particularly egregious and obscene, but it is not new because our time is short. And the subject in Florida at the moment is the subject of history, and more specifically of slavery. I would recommend to your viewers W.B. Du Bois's chapter in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction. So although Du Bois is talking about the misteachings and the miseducation of people around Reconstruction, what he has to say applies more broadly, right? Whether you're teaching history, whether you're teaching literature, and he's talking in that chapter about the deliberate attempt on the part of school boards, educators, etc., state legislatures to change facts of history so that the story will make for pleasant reading, right? And so this is Du Bois talking about, and he takes us through in that chapter of Black Reconstruction, the textbooks of the day, right? And the misstatement of facts, the distortion of truth, the fabrication of reality. He's talking about all of that in that chapter in Black Reconstruction, published in 1935. And the tragic thing is that except for references to specific individuals, right, one could simply substitute the names that are popular in contemporary headlines for Du Bois's references without there being any misrepresentation. So this is a long-winded way of saying none of this is new.
You know, Deborah, I think that I can't believe it's 2023. I mean, when I saw this headline, I was so stunned. However, at the same time, there also has been a trend over the last decade or so, maybe more actually, but I can't think of specific instances, but I just recall like having seen this trend towards the rewriting of history in general, right? Like with textbooks and a lot of these textbooks being based out of these publishers in Texas, and you have Republicans around the country. I mean, what you mentioned about like in the past during Reconstruction, all these people, all these like right wingers trying to change history. It's like that could be today because we still have that taking place across the country. But then also we have this other bigger issue in the last couple of years of this attack on critical race theory and like the right wing in the country trying to turn that into a culture war issue. I guess my question for you is like, how do you place the reason? Like, where do you place the reason for this? What's motivating this? Obviously, like DeSantis specifically has some like personal motivations here that seem quite political because I mean, Republicans are sort of in a fight about whether this is okay or not, but it does, go into this. It does, it is a part of this broader pattern that we've seen over the years. Why is this happening? What's that about? How do you like place this in that context?
Well, I will date myself by referring to or categorizing your question as the $64,000 question. Again, there are multiple reasons for this. Clearly, we have had so much more work coming out, much of it by Black people themselves, correcting the record, seeking to establish a more accurate version of U.S. history, right? And a part of that project, in the larger sense, has been to delineate the ongoing legacies of slavery in contemporary times. And so one answer would be, or one suggestion, I would say, would be if you can distort history, if you can rewrite history so that it isn't clear who did what to whom and why, right? Then you can distract from the reverberations of that history in this contemporary moment. And so that's one. A second reason, if you just want to confine yourself to the political sphere of electoral politics, then what have we seen intergenerationally? When parties, particularly the Republican Party, doesn't have anything else to run on, then let's manufacture culture wars, right? Let's not talk about the economy. Let's not talk about people who do not have housing. Let's not talk about food deserts in communities. Let's not talk about climate change and its devastating effect on people in Black communities. Let's not talk about any of that. Let's not talk about the massive debts that students carry as they try to be educated. Let's just manufacture a culture war. All right. So this is very familiar, a very familiar page in the playbook of the ideological right.
One of the elements of the Florida law that I've seen copied in other cities and states is this issue which I think is very important when we talk about just the act of learning. And I'll just read specifically here from the Florida legislation. An individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race. And I mean, how is it possible that you could teach the history of racism in America? And I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for all white people, but I can speak for Black people. We feel psychological distress all the time because of the history and the contemporary of racism. So, I mean, just talk about this if you could, just your reaction to that, because it just seems so absurd to me to say, okay, teach about all of the history of things in America, but don't make anyone feel uncomfortable that maybe their grandfather was out of lynching.
Well, how do I feel about that? Outraged. It is obscene. It is naive. Again, how can teachers control? I mean, we're talking about something that, despite a vast psychological literature or history of emotions, that no one has access to. This makes one person uncomfortable, another person not. I mean, it is absurd. It is it is an effort to manufacture a rationale that simply does not, that has no, nothing compelling about it. I don't know that you can simply decide that teaching, say, to switch to literature, the color purple, someone may feel uncomfortable, but someone who is the victim of sexual abuse and incest may feel affirmed. Right? And so whose feelings are we protecting? All right. Whose feelings are we protecting? And that is the question that none of these people can answer. And I think among the most obscene and hypocritical aspects of this whole discussion is the extent to which these people's children aren't even in the public schools. These children are in private academies, as they attempt to siphon off support for public schools. This is nothing but the standard old culture war issue. Slice the timeline wherever you will, whether it's Willie Horton, whether it's Jesse Helms. You wanted that job. You were qualified for that job. You deserved that job. And yet they gave it to this unqualified Negro. So again, we just, as obscene as all of this is, it is a part of a much longer and well organized strategy on the part of the ideological right. And how do I feel additionally? I feel we need to be organizing. We who are holding these discussions, we who are taking precious time to refute the inaccuracies in these standards of learning, right? No, so and so wasn't a slave. So and so didn't learn to be a blacksmith in slavery. So and so brought these skills about planting rice from Africa. That we are spending all of our time in the act of refuting. We have to get organized. These people have their representatives in all the state legislatures, right? On all the school boards, right here in Virginia, for example, one of the current candidates for school board is Antonin Scalia's daughter. All right.
Okay.
So we really need to understand that elections are important beyond every 4 years of the presidency, and that we need to organize in our communities where these egregious crimes, and I consider them crimes, are being committed and being perpetrated against our communities, our children, and their capacities to learn. We need to organize. This is war. This is war.
Yeah. And it also is worth mentioning that this is happening at a time when, affirmative action was just, undermined, completely overturned. I'm just curious your thoughts. Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that happening at this moment in time.
It's all connected. It is all connected. The interdiction of Black education is centuries old, right? Teaching a slave, for example, or an enslaved person to read was a punishable offense, right? People think that when you use slavery as an example or a precursor to what we're experiencing, that you're exaggerating. But it is not an exaggeration. The interdiction on Black learning, Black people's ability to read, write, etc. It's long. There is a long history, all right? So, and along with the idea that one, Black people are not fit to learn, they do not have the intellectual capacity to learn, right? And that affirmative action, which seeks or sought as a very, very ineffective intervention in some senses, but quite effective in others, comes with this notion that Black people would not be admitted to the University of Virginia but for the abolition of standards. That if they had to apply and be admitted to institutions of higher learning purely on the basis of their abilities and their quote unquote merit, they would not be in. And not only wouldn't they be in, but in letting them in, you are taking more deserved spots from people who do have the merit, who have earned the right to be there. So all of this is of a piece. Why would you object to an educated populace?
Mm.
You keep people in ignorance, you can control them. When Frederick Douglass is writing his first in 3 autobiographies, and the one most popular, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, written by himself, is the full title, published in 1845. There is a moment in the book where he laments having learned to read, because having learned to read really has opened his eyes to all manner of issues, and not only opened his eyes, I mean, his experience would have taught him the evils of slavery, but in learning to read and write, he can analyze those evils. He can submit them to interpretation. He can submit them to criticism. And therefore, he can say to audiences when he's on the abolitionist circuit, I will not stand here and narrate the horrors I experienced as a slave, beaten on my back. In other words, he argued, I will not be a physical specimen. I will not submit my body to your inspection so you can see the welts on my back. No, I will stand here and I will lecture to you about slavery. I will not only lecture to you about slavery, I will participate in the discourses of the day, the racist discourses of the day, and I will write about them, including the claims of the Negro ethnologically considered. All right. So again, we are talking about issues that are longstanding. We are talking about ideologies that have proceeded from among the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the land, right? The people were taught these myths, not only about slavery, but about Black American history more generally. All right. And so you look at curricula, you look at the rulings of the Supreme Court, you look at a court that is completely compromised, you look at a court, the integrity of which is completely demolished, all right, that we see every institution practically in this land collaborating with every other to fabricate the realities of U.S. history, right? Because this is U.S. history. Slavery, the existence of slavery for 400 years, U.S. chattel slavery, that's American history. That's it. You may deny it, but that's American history, right? And the whitewashing has taken many forms, not just in curricula, in public statuary, memorials, right? This is all of a piece. It is all, it all fits together. And I'm not the first person to say that when we are discussing U.S. history as if nobody ever did anything to anybody so that we can ward against anybody feeling bad, well, we're in deep trouble. And then that makes me very glad that I'm 72 years old and I have then lived the majority of my appointed days. So because it's insane.
Yeah.
Book banning is not new. None of this is new. And when we keep the accurate history away from students, we also prevent them from connecting the dots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the dots can be connected. Your question about affirmative action and its timing. I don't know are we out of time? I don't know how much time we
We
have.
got a minute. How about that?
Okay, well, I will just say that I am the principal investigator on the papers of Julian Bond. We are digitizing the over 50,000 documents Julian Bond
Wow.
bequeathed to the University of Virginia. He taught here for over 20 years. Well, we just worked our way through the speeches. The speeches Julian Bond is giving in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s about specific issues concerning education, economics, healthcare, the environment, you name it, could all be given right now without any adjustment whatsoever. We are continuing to fight these battles because we have reached no resolution, that our approaches to these issues have always been half measures. And because they have been half measures, we find ourselves decade after decade after decade fighting the same ideological battles.
Indeed. Dr. Deborah E. McDowell, Alice Griffin Professor of English at the University of Virginia, thank you so much for giving us some
Thank
of your
you
precious
for
time.
having me. It is my pleasure to be here. Okay. All
It's
right.
our
Be
pleasure.
well.
Take care now.
You too.
Well, that was an important conversation, and
Yes.
I just still cannot believe it's 2023. And I tweeted out that article, an article about what was happening in Florida, and I mean, there was a few people who responded to me like, "There's nothing untrue here," and I was just like, "What is happening?" Anyway,
Yeah, people living in a fantasy world. Anyway, yeah, we'll come back to this and talk more about it. I think Dr. McDowell was right. We could be on here for months talking about this. The distortions are massive, and I agree with you. It's amazing we're here, but we want to turn our attention to another major issue this week, or really last week going into this week, and that is the temporary end of the Black Sea grain deal that was negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, with the United Nations and Turkey also participating to facilitate the flow of grain out of Ukraine into the world market. And of course, this has been presented as, really in a very one-sided way, I think, Rania, which is basically that Russia, who decided to end the grain deal, and they decided to end the grain deal because one of the conditions they had placed on doing it in the first place was that there would be a relaxation of sanctions on the sort of main bank in Russia that deals with agriculture. And so that did not take place. It didn't happen. They weren't able to get it together at the last second, so they pulled out of the grain deal. But the way it's being presented as if somehow this is, deeply undermining, and the pictures you see there on the screen of the Russia-Africa summit happening today, that is deeply undermining the food sovereignty of Africa, that Africa is being starved because of Russia. And this, of course, has been a meme pretty much since the beginning of the conflict. And, there's just so many different things that one could say here. But I think the most important thing for me, Rania, is that most of the grain coming from Ukraine was not going to Africa. And it was also not going to developing nations. Now, part of the thing, what we think of in developing nations, because it's the WTO definition. So, China is still considered a developing nation because vis-a-vis the West, it has not caught up from a GDP perspective and other things. Turkey is considered a developing nation because vis-a-vis the West, it has not caught up. So I don't want to say it's a totally false designation, but of course, when we think about like poor countries that need food, you don't think about China or Turkey. Well, those were the top two buyers, more or less, of Ukrainian grain. And I just want to give a couple other statistics about this, Rhonda, that I think are very important. The 8 least developed countries in the world, all of which I believe are in Africa. One of them might be Papua New Guinea. Someone can fact check me there in the thing. But of the 8, basically the 8 poorest countries on earth, essentially, they got 6.8% of all Ukrainian grain exports. Spain, developed country, high-income country, got 19.4% of the Ukrainian grain. And just to put a finer point on that, Ethiopia, 120 million people in the country, definitely a low-income, developing country, got from Ukraine 282,760 metric tons of grain, while in the Netherlands, they got 1.92 million metric tons of grain that they mostly use to feed pigs. So I could go on and on this level, but there's other things that have to be taken into account here, which is that the sanctions on Russia have also increased the cost of food around the world because it's harder to ship, to get insurance, to do different things like that. So that increases the cost. So the sanctions are also playing a role in addition to the war in and of itself. And prior to this conflict, there was already a major crisis of hunger in the developing world, especially in Africa, due to inflation, due to high prices, due to poverty. And then there's been unbelievable droughts in Somalia and Kenya and Ethiopia, basically linked to climate change that have also made, the poverty-induced hunger even worse because those countries are not able to produce as much in terms of grain as they are supposed to. So anyway, a lot more that could be said. But I mean, just the fact that you've got the Netherlands getting more Ukrainian grain than Ethiopia, but somehow it's Russia who is stopping the Ukrainian grain from getting to Africa is just amazing to me.
So the population, it's worth repeating. The population of Ethiopia, 120 million people. Population of Netherlands, a little over 17 million. And I can't believe I didn't know that most of that is going to feed pigs. That says so much on top of the fact that, yes, what we're being told in the mainstream where it's all Russia's fault and Russia caused the breakdown of this deal because Russia's bad and Ukraine's trying to help and Russia's making it impossible is missing a lot of context. And I think it's really important what you said about sanctions because on top of sanctions are so multifaceted in terms of the consequences of them. And technically, there are these so-called carve-outs in Western sanctions for agriculture. That said, it doesn't matter. We know that the carve-outs and sanctions like this don't matter because at the end of the day, you mentioned insurance to get insurance for ships that are going to be shipping it. Not just that, Russia, like an agricultural sector, requires a lot of industrial-sized machinery. And we know that sanctions make it much more difficult, not just to import machinery, but for these kinds of things, you need a constant flow of spare parts. And obviously, a lot of these Russian companies now are not going to be able to purchase those spare parts because Russia's under crazy sanctions and no international company that makes these kinds of parts or these kinds of machines is going to be willing to risk the financial penalties that come from violating sanctions. And we've talked about sanctions on this show before. So the West needs to take responsibility for that, but of course they won't. Furthermore, I think the issue of financial speculation is really important because when we talk about, obviously, the breadbasket of one of the biggest breadbaskets of the world is Ukraine and Russia, right? In terms of not just importing grain and stuff, but also fertilizer, which you need for agriculture as well. Well, it's like when we talk about food security, of course, it's important that there's a war that's making that more difficult and all of the policies that go into that, Eugene. But you mentioned financial speculation. And it is really crazy. According to this one report that Vijay Prashad, who wrote about this, mentions in an article he recently wrote about the breakdown of this grain deal. According to this one report from the World Development Movement, something like 60% of the world food market is in the hands of financial speculators. Like they dominate the food market, 60% of it. That's insane. And it actually might have risen because that report is from a while ago. And you're better at this kind of stuff than I am. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about why that's so dangerous in terms of the financial speculation connected to the food market around the world.
Yeah, well, it's a huge issue. And again, it's one of these issues that irregardless of any war in Ukraine has always been an issue. One of the main actual places where, this speculation is happening is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, CME Group, one of the largest groups. But to help people understand, so if you think about food and grains, right, the number one thing we all know is that you grow certain crops over certain times. They grow over the season, they're harvested, then you have to plant them again. So basically you have a demand for food that is not directly matched to how food is grown. You have a lot of different things that are happening in the course of the world. So the price of what you could sell something for when you plant, let's say, wheat, and what you might be able to get for it when you sell the wheat could be vastly different based on the different realities and different pieces. So a lot of food, a huge amount of food, is actually sold on the basis of something called futures, right? That essentially you pay up front a certain price to a person, like I'm gonna get engaged in a deal where you're gonna pay me X amount of money so that when I harvest it, that you're going to get it for that amount of money. So essentially you're locking in the price, which is locking in a certain amount of certainty, which is really the only way to keep agricultural markets going, because if you don't have certainty, then you won't plant, and if you won't plant, you won't have food, and so on and so forth. But since the food market is so huge, these futures are one of the major things that become traded on financial markets, and the values of futures can also be used and traded against different assets and things like that. So it becomes a big part of the overall kind of Wall Street casino atmosphere that I think we all know about. And, you hear about it with mortgage-backed securities, you hear about it with other forms of derivatives and things like that. Futures, agricultural futures are a part of this. So there's a lot of speculation. Anyone who's seen the great movie from the 80s, Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, Trading Places, what's the price of orange juice in Florida? That's exactly what it's about, right? That people bet on what the prices are going to be. They bet on different things that are going to happen, good and bad, and they try to manipulate these futures markets to make money. But that ultimately means that the price of food is not just dependent on atmospheric conditions, on trade conditions, on the weather, on all these different things, but it's also dependent on how these traders in these markets are trying to manipulate these different factors to keep the price as high as possible, or to bet on the price to fall so that they can reap the windfall from that. So just like every other part of the financial economy, we see with grain prices and other food prices, a huge amount of manipulation that goes on by these speculators to drive up prices or to capitalize on the failure of certain crops and so on and so forth. So the number one factor is not making sure the most people have the maximum amount of food at the lowest possible prices to have food security on a global scale. It is, how can we make the maximum amount of money, even if it means that a lot of people will go hungry?
No, that's so important. I also, Eugene, I wanted to go back to the issue of, you mentioned the issue of like how much grain is going from Ukraine to these African countries. And then you also had mentioned that there's the Africa summit that started today in St. Petersburg. And I did see that Putin has promised to give free grain to 6 African nations after the collapse of this deal. And it's just interesting to see the way that it's portrayed in the Western press as something like nefarious to cut Ukraine out. That's how it's portrayed. It's an attempt to cut Ukraine out of the grain market in Africa. But that's so, like, it's like from what you explained before with how much grain is actually going from Ukraine to Africa versus other countries. It doesn't even make sense to say it that way. And I actually wonder if the irritation with giving free grain to 6 African countries from Russia is more about like undermining the food speculation you're talking about.
Well, I think that could certainly be some of it. And I think some of it is also anger that they have not been able to break the long-running agricultural ties between Russia and Africa. I mean, in the first 6 months of this year, Russia has exported about 10 million tons, I believe, of grain to Africa. It was 11.5 million tons in 2022. Over the past 5 years, there's been a big increase in the supply of fertilizers from Russia to Africa. Russia is also one of the biggest producers of fertilizers. 12% of fertilizers in Africa are, coming from Russia. And I just want to also mention parenthetically here that the largest ammonia pipeline in the world, which runs from Russia to the port of Odessa, and ammonia is a big part of making fertilizer, was exploded. Now, the Ukrainians say it wasn't them, but certainly they were blamed from the Russians, and it seems only the Ukrainian government would have benefited because it hurt the ability of Russia to make foreign exchange income. But it also was one of the factors that Russia was saying they want to return to the grain deal, but they want to ensure that pipeline is working so that they can get more fertilizer out. And so ultimately, when you look at countries like Egypt, you look at countries like Ethiopia, many countries across Africa, they have long-running pre-war in Ukraine relationships with Russia in terms of providing food. And I think one of the things that was sort of hoped for perhaps by some in the West with the original grain deal was that maybe they could displace Russia to some degree with the combination of the sanctions and the grain deal, and that has just not happened whatsoever. And you've got countries like Egypt, for instance, that even when they've been offered Ukrainian grain, have actually, to purchase, not to be given, have chosen to stick with their long-term partners in Russia because of these relationships. And now we're seeing those relationships continue to evolve. The foreign minister of Uganda raising this today at the Russia-Africa summit, that one of the things they're hoping to see is for Russia to help them set up their own fertilizer production more on the continent in Uganda. There's countries like Eritrea that has one of the largest potash reserves anywhere in the world, which is an important part of creating fertilizer. Was almost 400,000 tons of free fertilizer was given to Kenya by Russia, and they're allegedly going to start cooperating more on this front as well. So I think one of the things that the West is angry about is that African countries want to collaborate with Russia. They have good relations in terms of commercial relations on agriculture, and now they're putting pressure on Russia, but I think Russia has been somewhat open to this, but let's see what they actually do, and I think it'll be an interesting measuring stick to help develop the agricultural capabilities of these African countries from the point of view of technology, from the point of view of production, and so on and so forth, to make it easier for them to do that. And they haven't been able to break that despite the sanctions, and I think that's something that is very upsetting to many Western countries, and why they're presenting so nefariously the fact that Russia has in fact announced, I believe, 25 to 50,000 tons of grain they'll try to send in the coming months to, I believe it's Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia, and Eritrea. Russia also forgiving about $600-some million in debt to Somalia. It's old debt. So in some ways it was semi-symbolic. I don't know if they were trying to collect on it, but nonetheless, Somalia is a country that does not have a lot of resources to buy things on the global market. So any debt relief helps them in terms of their ability to act in that regard. But yes, I do think that some of what's going on here with the perception that Russia is somehow doing something nefarious is really about trying to break these links that are long-standing links between the Russian agricultural industry and many African countries.
Absolutely. And of course, in the meantime, all you have is you have these US officials going over to African countries and just like lecturing them about how they shouldn't be buying anything from Russia, and like finger wagging and trying to bully them. And it's like, is it any wonder that so many countries across the third world are rolling their eyes so hard at all of these American and frankly European officials who are just all like, no, do what we say, but we'll give you nothing. And then Russia's like, no, we'll give you free grain. And then they're supposed to all hate Russia. Like it's actually quite incredible, the level of arrogance and just, pure like collective narcissism on behalf of these Western countries.
Well, Rania, sorry, I did not hear the last part of your question here. My sound died
I didn't
a
ask
little
you.
bit, so
Well,
I think you're just making
I
a
didn't
comment.
ask you a question.
So if you wanted my
can you
answer
hear me
to
now?
something, I can't give it to you.
Well, I was just calling the West narcissistic. That's all. And arrogant. I mean,
Well,
I think we
can't
do that
hear you,
every show.
so-
Oh, you still can't hear me?
I can't hear you.
Okay, I don't know what's happening. Okay,
sorry.
I don't know how to help you. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you.
I'm trying to read your lips to see if I can find a way to do it, but I can't ultimately at the end of the day.
I figured at this point
But yeah,
we'd have enough
I'm sure whatever you're
energy.
saying is
Okay.
very smart, super intelligent, exactly what everyone wants to hear. One of the most important elements of anything that could ever be said. All those positive things. Okay, sorry, my sound is back. I'm sorry, Rania.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank God. That was like really scary. I felt so silenced.
Everyone but me could hear you. Don't worry.
Yeah. I was always so okay, but if you can't hear me, then am I really here? It's kind of like if a tree falls and Eugene isn't there to hear it. Did it
Thank
really
you.
happen? No, I was just calling the West and all Western officials basically like arrogant, narcissistic, like self-obsessed, obnoxious people who run around bullying and lecturing the third world and telling African countries they shouldn't be, purchasing anything from Russia. But meanwhile, they offer nothing in return. Like,
Yes.
Are you going to give these African countries grain? No, you're actually just going to continue to enforce policies that make it impossible for people in these countries to afford food.
Yeah.
I mean, meanwhile, Russia wants to give people free grain. I mean, it's like no wonder the third world is rolling their eyes at the Americans. Even some of the closest countries to the Americans are like, are you serious?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, you have even basically even America's closest allies on the continent have been heavily criticizing the sort of new Cold War atmosphere. I was looking for a quote and I can't find it here from the president of Comoros, Comoros is the presidency of the AU this morning. But I mean, he's been making points vis-a-vis this Russian-Africa summit that they consider Russia a priority partner, that they're moving towards a multipolar world. Africa, that is, the African Union is driving in this direction. They're trying to become their own pole in a multipolar world to develop, and that they want to work with everybody. But you've seen everyone from, President Museveni in Uganda, President Ruto in Kenya, the president of Ghana. I mean, people who are like, pro-America, basically, the President Ramaphosa in South Africa. And they keep saying, we don't want to, not only do we not want to be lectured, but like, we know what's best for us. So you don't need to come tell us what's best for us. We got this one. We know how to make deals that will, benefit us. But nonetheless, I think this bullying, lecturing tone is actually playing a big part in why Russia and China are gaining in popularity. I mean, someone told me a stat this morning that I think 81% of Nigerians have a positive view of China. Nigeria is the most popular country on the African continent. And you would think, if you just read the New York Times, that like everyone hates China or something in Africa. But in fact, the reverse seems to be true. But, the more you talk to people on the continent, part of the reason why you see people waving Russian flags and demonstrations and things like that, I mean, to some degree, I think some of that is trolling, to be honest with you. But I also think that a lot of it is people are trying to sort of put up a middle finger to the West, because it's sort of like, you're going to lecture us, you're going to tell us, you know better than us, and so on and so forth. Well, fine. Then we'll work with Russia. And what are you going to do then? And I really do feel that this is underrated in the U.S. commentary, and it seems totally impossible for U.S. politicians and American journalists to actually understand that at all. The final thing I'll say before we go to our next guest is I would actually urge everyone to go read a New York Times article. It's from last year, and they interviewed a woman who is a parliamentarian in Guinea-Bissau. She's a former liberation fighter in Guinea-Bissau, and they're asking, she's very pro-Russia, essentially, vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, and they're more or less asking her why. But the reason I say go read the article is not so much what she says, although it's very interesting, but the tone is so mocking. It's almost like they're mocking her, and it's so patronizing the way they're even talking about this. And I don't even know who the writer is, but I'm like, who is this random nobody writing for the New York Times, daring to take this kind of tone on someone who fought for the liberation of their country against Portuguese colonialism just because they have a different view on Ukraine? I mean, it's like you're living in an alternate universe. Like, literally no one else in the world is in agreement with this one-sided new Cold War approach outside of America and Europe. But nonetheless, it's like, it doesn't matter that the whole African continent, the whole Indian subcontinent, China, ASEAN, I mean, it doesn't matter in the discourse in the American media that all of these countries and multilateral institutions are 100% against the approach of the West in the war in Ukraine. It's just like, it's not a factor. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. And I get the way you just said, like, who are you? Some random ass like reporter at the New York Times who's probably done nothing in your life except like, if it's a New York, I'm just assuming it's somebody who went to an Ivy League institution and their parents did too. I could be wrong, but typically
they've certainly not fought for liberation against colonialism and freed their nation in a heroic way that has, reverberated through the decades.
But just like the idea that just because, like you said, somebody has a different opinion on Ukraine that is actually represents the majority of the world's opinion on Ukraine, just not the imperialist opinion on Ukraine, leads to this like rando reporter. Just that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's really incredible.
It is.
On that note, though.
Yeah, let's turn
on that note
the page quickly, but we'll come back to this, and I think the impact of the Russia-Africa summit will bring this very much into focus for the next couple of days. But we want to turn here to the political prisoner, Ruchell Senkyu McGee, who after many, many years in U.S. prisons is set to be released soon. We have Cameron Hurt with us, who's an organizer with the Coalition to Free Ruchell McGee and also with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, to talk more about this. Cam, thanks so much for being back with us.
It's an honor to be back with you. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to have you. And maybe just to start, for those who don't know, tell us, who is Ruchell McGee?
Yes. So you started it best. Ruchell McGee is an 84-year-old man, a black man in this country who has been under some type of incarceration for the past 67 years. And we're very, very honored to announce that through his struggle, through the struggle of his supporters on the outside, he is going to be released very soon. So this is amazing to hear. It couldn't have been possible without, of course, him persevering, because our coalition to free Ruchell Magee was founded in 2019. But if he hadn't defended himself, fought for his own liberation, and continued to demand justice, we wouldn't have this in the first place. And also, if the organizers of the past few decades hadn't laid the foundations, we'd be in a very different place. So very exciting. And I want to also thank Breakthrough for having us, not only when we were collecting signatures, but also, all the way through this release. So very, very appreciative.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And, I'm curious if you can tell our viewers who maybe haven't heard of Ruchell Magee, who is this person? What was he doing? I'm a political prisoner for all this time. What was he doing that was so threatening to the state, I guess? And yeah, how did he end up also being released, or coming to a point where he's about to be released?
Yes. So Ruchell Magee's story is long, but I'll make it short. In the 50s, he's first arrested over a typical Jim Crow relationship with a white woman kind of thing that lands him in jail in Angola for, 7 or 8 years, basically. That's one of the, very, very harsh prisons of Louisiana. So he's released, he goes to Los Angeles, and within a few months, he's arrested again for a kidnap to rob charge, which basically means there was a marijuana deal. After it went wrong, the other person accused him of kidnapping him. So he ends up not only arrested, but he's beaten before he goes to jail. In his own trial, his defense attorney is not on his side, commits malpractice of very negative types. And, he's also get bound and gagged during his own trial. So this is the type of racist, very much slavery descended type of behavior that he's receiving. This is the type of pressure that he's receiving. So what truly brings him to not only more political consciousness, but then also national, acclaim or, notoriety, depending on who you ask, is the 1970 Marin County Courthouse Rebellion. So in 1970, Jonathan Jackson, the younger brother of the revolutionary George Jackson, walks into the Marin County courthouse and basically says, "I'm taking over." And in that sense, he wants to free the Soledad brothers. There's a lot of great resources to learn about them, including the book Soledad Brother. But let's just say Jonathan really wants to free his brother, but seeing Ruchell Magee, James McClain, and William Christmas on the stand, they're involved in a different case. He offers them weapons, and, they basically leave the court with a judge and with a DA. So as they're leaving, that is when the police officers decide to open fire on the vehicle. They kill basically everyone involved except Ruchell Magee. Even the judge is killed by their bullets. So Ruchell Magee is basically given the brunt of all of the punishment that they couldn't give to Jonathan Jackson, that they couldn't give to, anyone else. So more or less, they decided we want to lock him up for life at that point. This is also where the famous, hunt for Angela Davis begins, is because she's accused of being the one providing the weapons for Jonathan Jackson. She's later acquitted thanks to an international movement to free Angela Davis. But Ruchell Magee stayed for the next 53 years. So that is the type of thing he's gone through, but he's truly advanced the struggle by being a jailhouse lawyer, supporting other prisoners. Even when a prisoner was beaten and tear gassed to death, Fred Billingsley, he provided a type of legal support that led to a settlement for the family. So always a giving, gentle person.
It's, one of these things I think, America denies they even have political prisoners. So to hear, these stories, I think is always so important to remember that reality. And, you mentioned it at the outset in terms of, what it took to get him released. And just talk a little bit about the campaign and what you all had to do and the steps that had to be taken to raise awareness, because I know it's been a very active campaign, especially the last few years, to make a big push to try to finally get him released. And I think it's important to note, some of that work as well.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I was introduced to not only George Jackson and Jonathan Jackson, but the case of Ruchell Magee through, older organizers, elders who had fought in the liberation movements of the and who are continuing to do the work of organizing. So people like Harold Welton and G2 Siddiqui, who have done amazing work with this coalition, they were the ones who put me onto this. We used to do letter writing sessions And for example, with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, we would pick several political prisoners to write letters to. So there came a time where it became, very obvious to all of us that we had to take that a step further, and we had to consolidate this into, yes, continuing to write to Rochelle to lift his spirits, but also to make some type of move to raise awareness on a deeper and more national scale, and also to be able to put some pressure to say that he needs to be released. So we launched, first of all, the website, freerochellemcgee.org. Of course, the coalition was founded in 2019. We had an amazing opening protest in 3 cities, one near the Marin County Courthouse, one in Los Angeles, and one in Sacramento. So that was kind of our launch day. And from there, we did more press conferences. We continued to meet and talk to officials within both the DA's office and the governor's office to push and say that, there's thousands, probably millions of people out there who want to see Rashid. And from there, we continue to do media work, the day-to-day coalition organizing work, getting, dozens of endorsers to support this, and even a virtual rally that included not only yourself, Eugene, but some amazing speakers like Angela Davis, Jalil Muntaqim, Jonathan Jackson, the son of Jonathan Jackson from 1970, Fred Hampton Jr., many, many others. So there were many routes that we took, including, the written word, the spoken word, everything possible, because we knew that Rochelle is the one who stands to benefit. We knew that we wanted him to know that there were people on the outside that didn't forget him 50 years ago, 40 years ago, but that he's still alive and well with us.
And okay, it's like, it is fantastic that he's going to be released. It's a huge victory. Of course, it doesn't give him 50 years back, but it's a huge victory. And he's not the only political prisoner. You guys are mentioning others. There's been many who've recently passed and never got the chance to be released, which is extremely unfortunate. But who are, you talk about this work isn't over. Now that this coalition succeeded in this aspect, like, who's next? Who should we be focusing on? Like, when we talk about political prisoners, I think a lot of people are aware of maybe like Julian Assange, who's certainly a political prisoner. But there are others still sitting in prison, a lot of them quite old at this point. Can you give us some names or give us an idea of like who you're working on next?
Yeah, absolutely. We take this victory. We are celebrating in our own ways. Rochelle definitely won't get those years back that he truly deserved. And at the same time, I feel as though he never wasted a day, because he was always doing something, whether it was writing, supporting other prisoners, and uplifting consciousness, within the prisons, most likely. So I want to say at the same time, our condolences to the losses that we've seen along the way, just in the few years of, this phase of organizing. We lost Romaine Chip Fitzgerald, Mutulu Shakur, Delbert and Chuck Africa. There's others that I can name, but, I'm certain that they would all be, very, very enthusiastic, happy to know what's happening here, because it's truly a combined, work that goes on. And truly there's people out there that include, we have Mumia Abu Jamal, we have Leonard Peltier, we have so many different people across this country, but also it's important to highlight that this political imprisonment by the imperialists, by the capitalists, is an international issue as well. So we include, the Palestinian writer Walid Daka, who's 62 years old. He's currently in the Zionist jails, being denied medical treatment, denied his right to, exist as a full human being, but he's still fighting, he's still struggling. So the Palestinian Youth Movement has put out a petition to demand his release. You can see that on their website and social media. So there's many different folks to talk about, but the truth is that this struggle has no borders, and the only way to end it is with a mass movement. And we hope that this struggle to free Rochelle McGee can be an inspiration to all those people who need to be freed and their supporters on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cam, before we let you go, I just want to ask if there are ways to continue to support, because I know for anyone who comes out of prison, there's a lot of costs, a lot of things that, come with that. And if you've been in for that long, it's even more difficult. So are there, fundraisers, other things people, can do to support?
Yes, that's a really excellent point. So number one, following along, the easiest way to do so is going to freerochellemcgee.org. That's a place where you can get on the email list, where you can read more about Rochelle's story. And there's also a donate button at the top. So As of right now, we have a re-entry fund. We have a goal of $33,500, which is $500 for every year that he's been incarcerated. At the current moment, we're at 85% of that goal. So we are close, and we want to, surpass that goal. We want to go even beyond it. So we really need support on that end. It's on a website called Fundraiser, like RAZR. But you can find that on the website, freerochellemcgee.org. You can also follow on social media, Free Rochelle McGee on Instagram. You can look up Coalition to Free Rochelle McGee on Facebook, or on Twitter, we're Free Rochelle Now. So altogether, it is absolutely true that, being in that type of condition for 7 years is definitely going to do a number on a person's body, any person. So Rochelle has been strong all these years. He's continuing to be strong, but the least we can do on the outside is support him in any way that we can. So please consider donating. Please consider following along with the work that continues after that.
Mm-hmm. Cameron Hurt, organizer with the Coalition to Free Rochelle McGee and with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Really, thanks so much for joining us here again on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Take care.
Such important work that so many people were, played a part in, including Cameron. I mean, it's like when it comes to the issue of political prisoners in the U.S., many people don't even understand that there's something called political prisoners in the U.S.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they deny it. And
huge
it's a huge issue. I mean, obviously, in Ireland, especially, the fight for political status was one of the biggest issues with the Irish, political prisoners, the idea that there should be a distinction, and we're not there. And so many people, and, I'm glad he lifted up the name of Chip Fitzgerald, who died in there as a teenager when he went in and given 2 life sentences and never got out. Unbelievable on so many different levels. And one thing that I think is sort of parenthetical to this, but that I do just want to mention that I think people should know, when you see these super long sentences that people are given, I mean, forget the fact that these political prisoners 9 times out of 10 either didn't do it, or the context of why they did it means that it really wasn't a crime in the sense that we think about it. But just putting that aside briefly, it is scientifically proven that long sentences have no deterrent effect whatsoever. So people feel like, oh, they did this terrible thing, put him in for life, put him in for 40 years, put him in for 20 years. There is no evidence that does anything at all to stop people from committing crimes. The same thing is true of the death penalty. And in fact, if you look at the United States right now, the states with the death penalty tend to have the highest murder rate. So right there, you can just see that these ridiculous punishments in and of themselves are, torture. They're not scientifically proven to do anything. They have no deterrent effect on crime whatsoever. And this sort of cruelty being the point is completely ridiculous. And it's just a shame that so many people are subjected to these conditions. But we can use that as a moment to segue here into our next story, which is to touch on the heat wave that is baking the planet. I mean, it's like every part of the world, it feels like, is so hot. Like everyone I know around the world, it's like, it's so hot where I live. And I'm just like, wow, me too. But also we want to talk about what you can do about it, or what we should do about it, which I think is equally as important. So we are very, very happy to be joined by Walter Smolarek, who's the editor of Liberation News, who actually wrote an article recently called 3 Things a Socialist Government Would Be Doing Right Now to Tackle the Heat Wave. Well, I want to get into that in a little bit, Walter. By the way, looking very nice. But I wanted to start, I mean, just give us a sense of how bad it is right now in terms of climate change.
Well, it's unbelievable. I mean, there's just a couple key facts that we could review. The 4 hottest days in the history of the Earth was this month. The 4th of July, the hottest day ever recorded in the history of the planet. The 8 hottest years ever recorded have been the last 8 years. And then you see, those are broad averages, right? The last 8 years, the hottest years on average. But of course, within those years, there are extreme heat waves. There's this heat dome meteorological effect. So it's terrible. It's really, really bad out there. And not only is it extremely uncomfortable, I mean, it's dangerous. It's deadly. On average, about 1,500 people in the United States die every year because of extreme heats. And that's just getting worse and worse and worse. And yet there's almost complete inaction on the part of the US government, on the part of major corporations, to address this issue that is of existential concern to everybody on the planet. And it's unmistakable. It's unignorable because you go outside and it's 90, 100, 110 degrees.
Oh, Rania, you're muted.
It's funny, you know why I'm muted? Because I was turning up the AC because it's so hot in Beirut where I am. No, I'm being serious. I didn't want you to have to hear the beep, which is a great save because of what we're talking about. But no, what I was saying when I was muted was that it's been so incredibly hot here in Beirut, and it's typically like this hot in August, like later in August, but it's like it happened quite early this time because of this heat wave in the Mediterranean. But it's actually everywhere. I mean, somebody was showing me this like Twitter thread. I was telling Eugene before we started recording, and it was like all of these video clips of just wildfires in different parts of the world. It was like southeastern France, and then another in Croatia, another in Morocco, another in Algeria. It's just like there was an island in Greece last week that was evacuated of tourists, which, maybe the people in Athens liked, I don't know, but it was evacuated because of wildfires on this island. I mean, it's all over the place. Obviously, there's like massive heat waves in the US. It's quite frightening. However, and it's getting a lot of coverage, right? Because everybody feels it. It's a really big deal. But we're never told in the media, like, what the cause of it is. It's just, like human activity, carbon emissions, climate change. There's never any mention of the economic system we have playing any role whatsoever, or the fact that like the Pentagon or the military, US military is the biggest polluter in the world. In a way, like it's good that we've gotten to a place where the media isn't both siding climate change anymore, and we're just admitting it's a thing that humans did. That's fine. But it still feels like a cover up when you're not talking about what led to here and what's still leading to here and what's an obstacle to doing anything about it. So I'm curious if you could just remind everybody like what brought us to this place very briefly. And like, what's the system behind it, Walter? I wonder.
Yeah, I say capitalism. I think that's the answer to your question. I know, right? But yeah, I mean, it's a good point, right? So humans cause climate change. Okay, finally, there's a consensus about that. But I wonder which humans. Is it all of us equally, or are we all just sort of to blame? No. The largest corporations on the planet are responsible for by far the majority of carbon emissions. So you can look at, the class structure within the different societies, right? The people who are in charge of the economic decisions are obviously the ones who are responsible for creating an economic structure that's based on the completely reckless burning of fossil fuels that creates enormous carbon emissions. The entire, not just the generation of energy, but the distribution of goods throughout society, the way agriculture is set up, the way that mass transportation is set up. I mean, all of that is designed to meet the needs of capital, of big business, of the ultra rich, in their quest to make more and more and more profits. That's what's at the core of this. And that's what's also at the core of government inaction on this measure. I mean, there's different factions of the elite. Some like to present an image that they're doing something about climate change, that they care about climate change. Others prefer a straight up just like denialist position, but none of them are talking about transforming the basics of the economic system that we live in to make it sustainable, to make it such that it doesn't destroy the planet.
Such a good point that you're making there, Walter, and especially coming on the heels of the report we saw that the Gulf Stream could collapse sometime in the next, by 2025, which basically, look it up. It's the implications of it are bad. But I'm glad you're making this point because I think a lot of the way people look at climate change is that the solutions are kind of like long-term solutions, and that like, yes, we need to do something about climate change, but that, more or less, it's nothing can be done right away, bending the curve, blah, 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 this year, that year, decades from now. But as I started, your article was 3 things a socialist government would be doing right now to tackle the heat wave. The implication being that with the right kind of institutions in place, there are things that could be done right away that could start to at least mitigate some of the worst elements that we're seeing from this massive heat wave. And I was hoping you could talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of things that could be done immediately right now. One is in housing, right? So I mentioned 1,500 people die in the United States every year because of extreme heat. About half of those people are homeless. And there are millions of empty, unused housing units in the United States. Those could be seized from their owners, which frequently are these like big financial firms, and given to people who do not have homes. I mean, that's like an immediate, quick solution. It would require disregarding the private property rights of the owners of those empty housing units. But maybe society could say, well, we think it's more important that people don't die from extreme heat. So that's one thing, and also, I mean, for people who do have homes, frequently it's substandard, right? The quality of housing, and that could mean that there isn't air conditioning, there isn't sufficient cooling, the sort of retrofitting of all of the basic infrastructure, housing infrastructure in the United States is also a key task, and it's something that would also create a lot of jobs too. A massive public works project of that scale. We also have to think about workers who work outside. So if you, deliver things on your bike, or if you're a farm worker, or if you work for, UPS or Amazon as a delivery driver. I mean, think of all the different construction, right? All the different jobs that are primarily or entirely outdoors. As the temperature continues to rise, that becomes very dangerous and, in fact, potentially deadly. So there needs to be labor laws, right? Guaranteeing cooling stations on the job, guaranteeing more breaks. And in circumstances where it's simply too hot for anybody to safely go outside, then the government should ensure everybody's income and say, stay home. It's not safe to work outside. That is something that could be done again right away, but it would require disregarding the private property rights of the business owners. And then you've got to look at the design of cities too. I mean, there's a complete lack of green space in most cities, especially in poor neighborhoods inside of major cities across the United States. The rapid expansion of green space, the installation of cooling stations can, deal with, what's called the urban heat island effect, where temperatures in cities are much hotter than other parts of the country, and poor neighborhoods in cities are hotter than rich neighborhoods. All of these things could be done on an emergency basis right away, not generations from now, not decades from now, not even years from now.
I'm curious, Walter, there are some socialist governments out there. What are they doing to address this? And I know it's difficult when they're not like the most powerful countries in the world. However, like all of this goes back to, having to undermine private property rights. So if you are a socialist country, you can do that. Are there any examples of what's taking place in some places?
Sure. Well, I mean, Cuba, which is undergoing like extreme economic hardship, extreme economic hardship, is still taking the transition to clean energy very seriously. They have a national plan to do that. They're also experimenting with, ecologically sustainable agricultural techniques, farming techniques. China is the biggest investor and manufacturer of renewable energy technology. That's something that even John Kerry had to acknowledge when he went to China recently for climate talks. So this is also points to something that I think is important in terms of the inequality of responsibility for climate change, because we can think like both within societies, the rich and major corporations are responsible, but then there's also inequality between the different countries. I mean, the wealthy, rich, imperialist countries were able to grow, to industrialize, essentially, to develop their productive capacity, using up all of the Earth's capacity to handle carbon, right? So by the time that the rest of the world was in a position where they were getting ready to industrialize, to develop, now there's climate change, and everybody has to deal with the consequences of that. So the socialist countries that are trying to address this are also grappling with that problem of underdevelopment, which makes it so much more difficult, and also points to the need for the wealthy countries to pay the climate debt, to pay essentially climate reparations to the global South.
Mm. Well, Walter, let me ask you another big question that there's no way you can answer in just the short few minutes we have left, but I think it's important, and that's how do we get from point A to point B? I mean, I think there might be a lot of people who say, well, great, I mean, I'm with you 100%. Seems like we should be eroding property rights if the, reward is that we save the planet and save our species as humanity. But how do we go from what we have now with, complete and total political gridlock and half the, institutions in America being filled with climate deniers? How do we get to a place where these things are possible?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the short answer and the long answer. I mean, I would say the short answer to that is that, we have to begin to organize, to develop a grassroots climate movement that's independent of these politicians who always make big promises when it comes to, when it's an election year, when they're on the campaign trail, but then never follow through on that. So I think the, changing the political calculus of the decision makers through, militant, disruptive climate protests, strikes, the walkouts that students and young people have been organizing. I mean, that's absolutely crucial. But in the long term, I mean, we have to end this system where the people who are making all of the decisions are the ones who are motivated only by profit. When it's the big corporations that are in charge of, essentially setting climate policy, when they're the ones who dominate the governments of the world. I mean, that's the essential power dynamic that has to change in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Walter Smolarek, as always, happy to have you with us. You are the editor of Liberation News, where, as I mentioned, you are the author of the recently penned piece, 3 Things a Socialist Government Would Be Doing Right Now to Tackle the Heat Wave. As always, an honor to have you with us here. So thanks for joining us on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a lot to consider, a lot to think about, as we all have to endure crazy amounts of heat. And hopefully ACs, if we have them, keep working, because they break down a lot this time of year. Like, I know for my own parents who are in Virginia, it's like every summer the AC stops working and they have to wait
puts more and more stress on the grid. It's sort of like the weird feedback loop of climate change, is that the more climate change gets worse, the more people need AC to stay cool and stay alive and to refrigerate different things and so on and so forth, which means the more energy you have to use, which then drives the same thing. So it's sort of like, I mean, you really have to disrupt that cycle in a major way by reducing the amount of carbon emissions so that we can try to curb the worst ever effects. I mean, that's the sad part, is there are some things that are maybe irreversible that it's gotten so bad, but I think the worst of the worst can be avoided, and that is, the extinction of humanity on the planet, and that's not, a small piece at all when we consider this. But I'm glad that you mentioned, Rania, the issue of other countries and other places. It's a good segue into our next story here on the show, and that is an eyewitness report from China. Friend of the show, Carlos Martinez, who is also the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, was just in China and was able to see a number of different things. So we are very happy to have him with us to just start to cut through the fog, as it were, on a number of I don't know, all the things we hear about China that are all relatively one-sided. Carlos, thanks for being with us.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going very well, and we are very happy to have you. And as you probably heard, we just actually left off talking about climate change, and our last guest mentioned that China is the country that is producing, the most sort of clean energy infrastructure of any country on Earth. So you were just there. I wonder, when you're on the ground, do you get any sense of how China is addressing the issue of climate change and how it's playing in the population?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few elements to this. One thing you notice, we went to 4 cities. We went to Guangzhou, we went to Beijing, we went to Guiyang, we went to Sunyi, and all of them, the transport infrastructure is excellent, particularly the public transport. So high-speed rail has been rolled out throughout the country, and it's cheap, it's very good quality, it's very fast, it's very comfortable, it's very convenient. And as I say, like, say, Guangzhou and Beijing, these are world-class cities. You kind of expect them to have the best of the best in terms of the infrastructure, but you've got this everywhere. Actually, not this time, but last time I went to China, which was 3-4 years ago, We went to Urumqi in the far west, the capital of Xinjiang, and they'd also just opened up their first high-speed rail and their first metro line as well. So that's a very important component, the transport. There's also buses everywhere. Nearly all the buses are electric now. Shenzhen, which we didn't go to, unfortunately, because it's just down the road from Guangzhou, but Shenzhen is actually the first city in the world to have 100% electric bus fleet. There's still lots of cars. There's too many cars. But increasingly now, those are electric vehicles. And a lot of the big cities in China are kind of actively phasing out petrol cars. And all of these cities, super green, right? Like trees at the side of the roads, trees down the middle of the roads. There's lots of parks. They're very well-maintained parks. A lot of them have only been built in the last few years. I was speaking to a friend who lives in Beijing, and he's been living there since 2015, 2016. He said even in his neighborhood, like there are parks that have cropped up in the last few years that weren't there previously, and they're extremely well maintained. And in general, I think there's just a very big focus on green development. People know about the slogans about ecological civilization and about this idea of a modern socialism that's green and beautiful and so on. And we know about the commitments that China's made in relation to peaking carbon emissions by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2060, which are historically incredibly ambitious goals. But what's clear when you get there is that they're not just slogans. Like, we went to several presentations and question and answer sessions about modernization, and environmental sustainability was like a central theme in all of them. So it's clear that these ideas are informing policy at every level of government, at every level of the economy.
Carlos, I also imagine you had lots of conversations with people across these cities that may have, I would think, centered a bit around the current geopolitical escalation by the U.S. Obviously, there's been years of saber rattling when it comes to the way U.S. officials talk about China, and that continues to get worse, but also the policies themselves. I mean, the U.S. has basically launched an economic war on China, particularly in this attempt to, ban or really push back the advances made by China's companies that make things like semiconductors and these sorts of things. So I'm just curious, what was the conversation you had with people? What were people saying with regard to the U.S. saber rattling, the escalation in policy, whether we're talking about attacking China's economy or the just militarily surrounding China and constantly invoking potential war over Taiwan?
Right. I mean, I think people are quite confused at the hostility that they're seeing from the West. I have to say that hostility is not reciprocated, in terms of how foreigners are treated in Beijing or in Guangzhou or whatever. There's lots of foreigners. Everyone gets on fine. There's no hostility. People are living their lives. And one thing I noticed was unlike in the West, because people aren't exposed to this constant racist propaganda that goes with the new Cold War and that goes with the new McCarthyism, the confrontation doesn't manifest itself in acts of anti-American or anti-British violence or threats or hostility in general, in the same way that very sadly it does on the streets of London and it does on the streets of New York City. I think people understand very well that it's our politicians and it's our capitalist media that are driving all of this, and it's not ordinary people. And actually, I think the Chinese, whether you're speaking to government officials or people doing business or just ordinary citizens, they're super keen to have more people-to-people exchanges. They love it if people come from the West and visit China and see it for themselves, so that they can kind of understand it beyond the propaganda. They're not trying to decouple. Their line basically is that, well, China's got its own civilization, it's got its own traditions, it's got its own politics, and so does the West, and we can all learn from one another. And it's a very healthy attitude, and frankly, we do quite well to adopt it for ourselves. But I think there's a lot of bemusement, being accused of aggression, a little bit ironic, and people understand that, we in the West don't learn about, in Britain, we don't learn about, meaningfully speaking, the history of the British Empire. I'm sure the majority of people in the US wouldn't know the statistic that the US has been at war for 228 years of its 247 years of existence. I imagine that, unlike in China, people in the US today aren't marking the 70th anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement, right? You know, and they don't mind that the US is continuing its aggression towards Korea even today, that it still maintains military bases in South Korea, thousands of troops, still engaged in nuclear-enabled war games, still imposing like an economic stranglehold and illegal sanctions. It still maintains wartime operational control of South Korea's armed forces. It still refuses to like actually end the war, like it stands in the way of a peace treaty. So here is, the biggest and most aggressive military power of all time, which is constructing this huge infrastructure of Cold War with its 800 bases, with its $1 trillion military budget, with its AUKUS, with its Quad, with its troops stationed in nearly 150 countries, with its awful record of bombing Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria into the Stone Age, and meanwhile fomenting the conflict in Ukraine, insisting on this whole strategy of fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. I mean, I think Chinese people are thinking, you don't get to label us as aggressive. We're not aggressive. We'll defend ourselves. Absolutely. It's not kind of the century of humiliation anymore. If you think that you're going to dominate us and that you're going to prevent our independent and our sovereign rise, you're wrong. But we're not aggressive.
One of the things that I wanted to touch on, and I'm glad you made the point of, sort of China having its own history, its own culture, its own institutions, because, the way China is portrayed in the West is that there's no agency anywhere. Everything is decided by like Xi Jinping and maybe 10 other people, and it's just brought down from the top, and everyone is moving through life like sort of robots and automatons. I mean, in a way, it seems so cartoonish. It's unfortunate we have to knock it down, but I'm curious, in the times you've been there in China, and certainly most recently, what sense you've gotten of that, especially at the grassroots level, of how people are involved in their society. They're not just spectators.
Yeah, that's really interesting. While we were there, actually, we had a quite unique opportunity to look around this community, like a pretty small community in Guiyang. So it's in Guizhou, which is one of the poorest provinces of China. And it's like an experimental community. It was set up like 10 years ago, specifically to experiment with grassroots government. And I think that reflects a national drive to figure out how we improve, or how China improves grassroots governance, how we increase participation, how we deepen a sense of community, deepen people's sense of ownership and involvement with running their own lives, with running their own communities, with running their own societies. And, it's a really impressive and lovely community. The village leaders, like this super enthusiastic young woman who I guess when in her 30s, she'd actually been elected as a delegate to the 20th Congress of the CPC. And, several apartment blocks, really nice, high quality apartment blocks, tons of green space, tons of common areas, activity clubs, social clubs, a library. And they've got a team of employees and a team of volunteers who are nearly all CPC members who are available to help out with pretty much anything and everything. For example, during the COVID period, a lot of that was helping out elder people who don't live with family. And, for those of us who lived with lockdowns, whether in Britain or on the other side of the Atlantic, that a lot of elder people suffered incredibly badly during the COVID period. They have regular meetings to kind of gather suggestions, gather feedback, deal with criticisms, make plans, and so on. And this is like one experiment of thousands around the country. And the results will be used, obviously, to help inform national strategy. And it's a very, it's a very Chinese approach, the whole crossing the river by feeling the stones. Like they're experimenting, they conduct a bunch of experiments, bring the results together and use that to inform national policy. And I think the aim is to figure out what whole process people's democracy looks like going forward. They've defined an overall vision of whole process people's socialist democracy, and they're trying to put meat on those bones. Xi Jinping said a couple of years ago, he kind of criticized the Western so-called the liberal democratic model, by saying something along the lines of, democracy can't just mean voting every few years for someone who makes some promises and then doesn't do anything for the people. Democracy isn't really democracy if it's a money democracy. So China's in that process of developing and defining what a modern socialist democracy is and what works for them.
Yeah, it's all very important. I'm curious also, Carlos, I imagine that there was probably some conversations about like developments around the world, particularly with regard to the war in Ukraine. I would assume, like, what was the view of the war in Ukraine by just, average people you spoke to? And I think that a lot of people in the US would have the impression that you walk around and people are just like cheering Putin or something.
Well, there's a huge.
Sometimes they are, and sometimes they are. Sometimes there are, by the way. And certainly where I live, there are. That's absolutely the case in some places.
Sure. There's a huge diversity of opinion in relation to the Ukraine crisis. Going back to what you were saying earlier about, people think that Chinese people are automatons and they're told by the government, told by Xi Jinping what to think. Actually, there's an incredible variety of opinion and a huge quantity of very lively debate. I think the quantity and the quality of the debate is much larger, much richer than it is on this part of the world. I think, China's focus is on peace. China really wants peace in Ukraine. And I think, if you compare China's actions in relation to the Ukraine crisis with the US's actions in relation to the Ukraine crisis, the kind of facts speak for themselves. What has China been doing? China has been strongly encouraging the protagonists to sit down with each other. It's been strongly encouraging the US and NATO not to engage in an expansionist project. The Chinese have clearly recognized and said explicitly that the core of the problem is NATO expansion. The core of the problem is Russia's security concerns, which are legitimate, which is not necessarily to support or condone what the actions Russia's taken. But the Chinese are clear that what's going on in Ukraine isn't simply a function of kind of Putin's psychopathology, but it's a function of very real security concerns and the US's process and NATO's process of expansion, of domination, of hegemony. So that's been clear from the beginning. They've also sent a special envoy to try and stimulate negotiations and some kind of peaceful solution to the crisis. Putin's obviously visited Xi Jinping's obviously visited Putin personally, spent several days in Moscow. He's had phone conversations with Zelensky. So their whole orientation is towards a negotiated solution and against escalation. They've spoken out very clearly against economic coercion, against sanctions, against the supply of heavier and heavier weaponry, where it's quite obvious that the US is trying to repeat what it did in relation to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan in the 1980s with Russia and Ukraine in the 2020s. So if you look at the US's aggressive stance and the US's insistence on keeping the war going, and you compare it with the Chinese insistence on pursuing a peaceful, diplomatic, negotiated solution, they're the opposite approaches. And I think that's very well recognized within China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Carlos, as always, we're very happy to have you with us. And I just have to mention, of course, before we let you go, that you are also the author of The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, that is covering many of these topics in a much more in-depth way. And I highly suggest folks check out The East is Still Red. Carlos Martinez is the author, also the co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China. And as always, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Wow, Eugene, this was a successful show, I feel. We talked about a lot of really important issues that I don't think CNN is doing like we do.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
I certainly agree with you on that. I just wanted to briefly also shout out great pen name, so to speak, Timbo Slice, who donated earlier. Thank you for
What's with those
using
punches?
that.
Wait, why are we using
Okay,
punching sounds?
Rania, no, don't even ask, because
No,
I
I
don't
just
want people to
like I
know that you
understand the
don't know who Timbo
cheering.
Slice is. Timbo Slice is a play
Oh.
on Kimbo Slice. Just Google it after the show. Don't admit that you don't
Do
know.
I look like the kind of person who's just gonna know random sports things?
Well, to even say that's a sports reference is even a little. Just Google it afterwards. But either way, Timbo Slice, I like your name, Owen Line. I know it's not your real name, but nonetheless,
I appreciate you
really
trying to
appreciate your
protect me.
donation. I agree with you, Rania. Yes, very successful show. Anything you want to leave our viewers with on the way out?
I do. First of all, I forgot to do this throughout the show. I forgot to yell at our listeners, but there's no need to yell at them because they did a fantastic job liking the show today. If you have not liked it and you're still watching the live stream, please make sure you hit that like button. It certainly helps us in the algorithm. But also know that we do have exclusive content that is only available to members of Breakthrough News. And you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a patron. And you can access exclusive content, parts of my show dispatches, Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, as well as now there's a mug. You get a cool mug. Eugene, show them the mug again. Beautiful new mug with the new Breakthrough logo. Yes, I love it. I want one.
Thank you. Shout out to our editor-in-chief, Ben Becker, for commenting in the chat on the nice mug.
It's very cool. Yeah.
Not a neutral comment, but a true comment.
Yeah. So definitely become a patron if you can at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And Eugene, I think that's pretty much all I have. Already embarrassed myself enough, so I'm not going to make any jokes that I have to explain. I'm just going to leave it there.
Listen, don't stop being you, Rania. That's why we like you.
Never.
But nonetheless, I agree. That's all I got too. So for us here at Breakthrough News and the Freedom Side, we will see you next time.
We did it, Joe.